on behalf of the American Friends Service Committee and Defense for Children in International Palestine. I thank you for joining us today to talk about the impact of 50 years of Israeli occupation on Palestinian children. For those of you in the Middle East and the Middle West and in communities around the United States who are following the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, we thank you for joining us on Facebook Live, and we welcome your comments and questions in our live feed as we proceed this morning. So thanks for joining us in the room and around the world, including in Palestine this morning or this afternoon. Today's program will include 4 brief presentations that will examine the challenges facing Palestinian children living in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and inside Israel. We will follow these remarks with questions and answers from all of you. This week marks 50 years since the 1967 war and 5 decades of Israeli military occupation of approximately 5 million Palestinians, nearly half of whom are children. For the past 50 years, Israel's occupation has entrenched a deeply abusive system of inequality and injustice that denies Palestinians their basic rights. More than 40% of Palestinian men have been imprisoned over the course of the occupation. Since 1967, nearly 50,000 Palestinian homes have been destroyed. Torture, beatings, detention without trial, assassination, displacement, dispossession, movement restrictions, limited access to resources. These are the abuses that have become routine as a result of Israel's military occupation. With us today are 3 lawyers and a college student whose work should inspire us to strengthen the call for accountability for human rights violations and inspire us to build stronger support for freedom, justice, and equality for all children in the region. We will first hear from Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Human Rights Watch is a global nonprofit, non-governmental human rights organization guided by international human rights and humanitarian law, working to uphold human dignity and advance the cause of human rights for all. Omar Shakir's experiences prior to joining Human Rights Watch include focusing on U.S. counterterrorism policies, including legal representation of Guantanamo detainees by a fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights. A former Fulbright scholar in Syria, Omar Shakir holds a JD from Stanford Law School, an MA from Arab Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs, and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. Brad Parker will speak after Omar Shakir. Brad Parker is staff attorney and international advocacy officer at Defense for Children International Palestine, DCI. DCI is an independent local Palestinian child's rights organization dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of children living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Brad Parker specializes in issues of juvenile justice and grave violations against children during armed conflict, and leads DCI's legal advocacy efforts on Palestinian children's rights in the U.S., including co-leading the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. He is a graduate of the University of Vermont and received his JD from the City University of New York School of Law. After Brad Parker, we will hear from Yazin Mekbel, a student at Goshen College and Leo Education Scholar. Yazin Mekbel grew up in the West Bank town of Beit Omar, where he was the founder of the local committee for youth and a leader of the youth movement at his local high school. At Goshen College in Indiana, Yazin Mekbel is majoring in biochemistry, but recently won the C. Henry Smith Oratorical Peace Contest for his speech, beyond occupation of body and mind. Yazin Mekbil's family are refugees living in a house that has 10 demolition orders from the Israeli military. Yazin Mekbil's father was arrested by the Israeli army when he was 15 years old, and all of his friends and cousins were detained or arrested since then. 2 of his friends were killed by the Israeli army. To end our program, we will hear from Nadia Ben Youssef, director of the Adallah Justice Project. Adallah, which means justice in Arabic, is an independent human rights organization and legal center. Established in November 1996, it works to promote and defend the rights of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, 1.2 million people, or 20% of the population, as well as Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territory. Nadia Ben Youssef has worked with Adallah since 2010, coordinating international advocacy on behalf of the Bedouin community and the Nakab, and then serving as Adallah's first representative in the United States. Much of Nadia Ben Youssef's work in the U.S. has focused on building a transnational movement against supremacy and state-sanctioned violence, together with cause lawyers, community organizers, and artists across the movements for social justice. Nadia Ben Youssef is a member of the New York State Bar and holds a BA in sociology from Princeton University and a JD from Boston College Law School. So thank you, all of you, for being with us, and it's wonderful to see this packed room, and we'll get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining. My name is Ahmad Shaker from Human Rights Watch. This week marks 50 years of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Golan Heights, and Gaza Strip, making it, according to the International Committee for the Red Cross, the world's longest sustained military occupation in modern history. Reflecting this week on the magnitude of 5 decades of Israeli occupation, the UN Coordinator for Humanitarian Aid and Development Aid, Robert Piper, declared that the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories is the most long-standing protection crisis in the UN's history. Here in the United States, this occasion has passed with hardly any mention, despite recent warnings by public officials and others about the urgency of the situation on the ground. Just in October, the State Department warned that Israel's decision at the time to build new settlement units marked, and I quote, another step towards cementing a one-state reality of perpetual occupation that is inconsistent with Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. In his final press conference, former President Barack Obama echoed a similar message, and I quote, I don't see how this issue gets resolved in a way that maintains Israel as both Jewish and a democracy. Because if you do not have 2 states, then in some form or fashion you are extending an occupation. Functionally, you end up having 1 state in which millions of people are disenfranchised and operate as second-class residents. You can't call them citizens necessarily. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to tell you that the scenario that the State Department and President Obama spoke of is not some hypothetical future scenario, but rather a description of the current reality on the ground that has been the case for much of the life of Israel's occupation. As part of our work as Human Rights Watch, documenting human rights abuses and advocating for human rights protections in over 90 countries across the world, we have been documenting abuse in Israel and Palestine for nearly 3 decades. And for much of this time, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we've found ourselves documenting the same sorts of abuses. In particular, Israel has sustained its occupation through repression and systematic abuses of the Palestinian population's rights. It today maintains its occupation through an entrenched system of institutional discrimination against Palestinians in the occupied territory. Many of these abusive practices, of course, as many of you are aware, have been justified in the name of security. Indeed, Palestinian armed groups have carried out scores of lethal attacks on civilians and launched thousands of rockets on Israeli civilian areas in violation of international humanitarian law. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem estimates that between 1987 and the end of February 2017, 1,087 Israeli civilians have been killed in these attacks. However, Israel's repression extends far beyond any security rationale. At least 5 major categories of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law characterize this occupation, each of which has profound implications for Palestinian children. And I'll go through each of those categories in brief. The first, unlawful killings and war crimes without accountability. In the last Gaza war alone, in July and August of 2014, Israeli forces killed at least 2,100 Palestinians. The UN identified over 1,500 of those as civilians, and over 500 as children. Many of these attacks, according to investigations carried out by Human Rights Watch, constituted violations of international humanitarian law, and some even war crimes, including the apparent targeting of civilian structures. In addition, Israeli security forces routinely use excessive force in policing situations, and they have killed, in the span of the occupation, thousands of Palestinians, whether they be demonstrators, rock throwers, passers-by, suspected assailants, or others, with live ammunition when lesser means could have maintained order. Human Rights Watch, in the last year, interviewed a family from the refugee camp of Qalandia in the occupied West Bank that has lost 3 of their sons, each to excessive force used by Israel. In 2001, 11-year-old Yasser was shot while throwing stones. The Israeli Defense Forces carried out an investigation and found the forces had adhered to firing guidelines. 40 days later, their other son, 15-year-old Samer, was killed, also on the claim that he was throwing rocks. No one was held to account. 14 years later, their 17-year-old son, Muhammad, was shot from a distance of 10 meters away as he ran away from an Israeli jeep after, according to witnesses interviewed by the Israeli Human Rights, it is not a matter of a few isolated cases, but rather is a systematic policy. The failure to hold perpetrators of serious crimes to account, whether it be on the Israeli or the Palestinian side, has unfortunately been a characteristic of 5 decades of occupation. In fact, B'Tselem has described Israeli investigations as, quote, a whitewash operation. The second category of abuse that Human Rights Watch has found characteristic or endemic of this occupation is illegal settlements and the accompanying discriminatory system. Israeli authorities have facilitated the transfer of their own civilians to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which is a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention and a war crime. Today, there are over 580,000 settlers living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, alongside well over 2 million Palestinians. Israel applies Israel's civil law to those Jewish Israeli settlers, affording them legal protections, rights, and benefits not extended to Palestinians living in the very same territory, who are subject to Israeli military law. Israel also provides settlers with infrastructure, services, and subsidies that it denies to Palestinians, creating a separate and unequal system of laws, rules, and services. And that's not just a term that Human Rights Watch used. Outgoing Secretary of State John Kerry used the very same term to describe treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So imagine this reality today. You can have a Palestinian kid and an Israeli kid who live 2 kilometers apart. If the Israeli kid commits a crime, he is tried in an Israeli civil court under Israeli civil law. If a Palestinian child 2 kilometers away commits a crime, he is tried in military court subject to military law. People living in the very same territory. And that discrimination, that institutional discrimination that has become endemic, extends to virtually every aspect of life in the occupied West Bank, including things like access to water and freedom of movement. The third abuse that we've documented is forced displacement. Now, this takes several forms. First, and most directly, is the expropriation of thousands of acres of Palestinian land, the theft of Palestinian land for settlements and the supporting infrastructure. It also extends, though, to Israel's policy of arbitrarily excluding thousands of Palestinians from the population registry, which restricts their ability to live and travel in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel has also revoked the residency of over 130,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and nearly 15,000 in Jerusalem alone. Israel also imposes discriminatory burdens on Palestinians when it comes to permitting. So in nearly 60% of the West Bank, Area C that's under exclusive Israeli control, it is nearly impossible for a Palestinian to obtain a permit to build a home. And it's the same situation in East Jerusalem, which effectively forces families to make a decision. Either you leave your homes or you build a home without a permit and risk home demolition. And indeed, Israel has carried out thousands of home demolitions on the basis of lacking a permit. Just last month, Human Rights Watch documented the case of Ashraf and Islam Fawaka from East Jerusalem, who were at the checkup for their 1-month-old daughter when they got a call that their home had been demolished for lacking a permit. Today, their now 2-month-old daughter Aya, their 4-year-old Saba, their 7-year-old Remus, and their 9-year-old Ritaj are residing in a tent alongside the ruins of their former home. The fourth category of abuse Human Rights Watch has documented is the Gaza closure and unjustified movement restrictions in the West Bank. In the West Bank, those restrictions take the form of checkpoints and the separation barrier, 85% of which is not built on the green line that separates Israel and the West Bank, but rather cuts and slices deep into the West Bank, which the International Court of Justice found to be a violation of international humanitarian law. In Gaza, for the last 25 years, Israel has tightened restrictions on the movement of people and goods. Although Israel withdrew in 2005, it maintains control of the airspace, the water space, the border, the entry of people and goods. It effectively runs Gaza as an open-air prison today. Next week marks 10 years of Israel's closure of Gaza, in which it effectively has had a travel ban on the entry or exit of any Palestinians from Gaza, subject to a set of exemptions. And even with exemptions, such as for urgent medical situations, it's been very difficult in practice for Palestinians to leave. In fact, the World Health Organization in December of 2016 found that only 41.7% of Palestinians that applied for a permit with an urgent medical situation were able to obtain one. Just in January, a 17-year-old, Ahmed Shubair, died of heart failure, having a congenital heart condition. He had been denied a permit to go to Israel for medical treatment just several months before. As you can imagine, the Gaza closure affects every aspect of life. Gaza's GDP today is 23% lower than it was in 1994, and 70% of Palestinians in Gaza rely on humanitarian aid to survive. And the final category of abuse that Human Rights Watch has documented over the course of the life of the occupation is abusive detention. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been detained, the majority in military courts that have a near 100% conviction rate. Hundreds annually have been held on average in administrative detention based on secret evidence without charge or trial. Some have been held for doing no more than engaging in nonviolent activism. Israel detains Palestinian detainees from the West Bank and Gaza within Israel, which is a violation of international humanitarian law, and imposes onerous restrictions on family visits. And children have been detained as young as 11 years old. And many of those detained, as we've documented, and you'll hear more of shortly, have been subjected to force in detention, including choking, use of stun grenades, and threats and interrogations without the presence of parents and a lawyer. Criminal lawyers tell us this practice governs the occupation is based on the idea of occupation being temporary and exceptional. What we have today is an effectively permanent, prolonged occupation with no end in sight. This is a situation that has few precedents in history. But what we do know is as time goes on, the rights, obligations, and duties upon Israel as an occupying power only increase. My final point I want to make is that after 50 years of occupation and decades of a fruitless peace process, it should be clear to everybody that downplaying rights will not ease the path to a solution. There's a need for us to take action on human rights and to have accountability, without which peace is simply not possible. In this country, we've held the two-state solution as a holy grail, but not because the situation on the ground, not because settlements are war crime, not because settlements are established on land unlawfully seized from Palestinians, not because settlements wreak havoc on the everyday life of Palestinians, not because of the system of institutional discrimination on the ground, but simply around the idea of separation. Any discussion of solution needs to be grounded in the reality of 50 years of occupation, repression, systematic abuse, and institutional discrimination. We need action. Let us not be here in 50 years bemoaning another 50 years of ugly, abusive occupation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Parker. I'm an attorney and international advocacy officer with Defense for Children International Palestine. Thank you. It's nice to have a great full room. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introductions. What I'm going to try to do is focus in on what it means to be a Palestinian child living today in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. What it means to be a Palestinian child living, growing up under 50 years of military occupation. To give you a sense of the context, the Palestinian population, when we talk about the population generally, it is an incredibly youthful generation. The majority of the population is under 25 years old. So when we talk about Palestinian rights, we talk about violations against Palestinians. We're talking about rights violations against children, a population of children. Generations of Palestinian children grown up knowing nothing but occupation, repeated military offensives, constant settlement expansion, seeing the separation wall be built, cutting off their communities, separating their families from their land, from their livelihoods, checkpoints, closure, right? These are the things that have become inherent in 50 years of occupation against international law, as Omar mentioned, and have become pervasive, entrenched. Right? This is the infrastructure that Palestinian children interact with when they interact with Israeli military occupation. It's not something that's untangible. Right? There's a very physical presence in Palestinian children's lives for occupation. Palestinian children find themselves in this moment today with absolutely no leadership anywhere that is willing to challenge the systemic impunity that allows violations to continue, or a political vision that would sketch a course for the future that would end the occupation. To give a sense of where we are, there's this idea that there's a status quo that's existed, that as the peace process has sort of fallen apart, there's something that can be maintained and managed. This is false. Right? Things have been deteriorating significantly over the past several years. And I'll go into a few specific issues that we've documented as Defense for Children International Palestine to give you a sense of where things are today. 2016 marked the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank in the past decade. We had at least 32 Palestinian children killed with live ammunition or crowd-controlled weapons fired by Israeli forces. In Gaza, children slip deeper into poverty. As the blockade begins its 10th year, many children are still living in protracted displacement. Significant numbers of West Bank children have also been displaced as Israel has carried out a record-breaking pace of home demolitions alongside increasing and constant settlement expansion. Equally alarming, ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces has continued unabated. There's been significant deteriorations that I'll mention shortly. Since 2014, Israeli forces have increased the use of live ammunition to squash protests. In 2015, we noticed this trend sort of with an uptick in violence and shootings, child fatalities, and then in 2015, it continued. In 2015, there was also regulation changes to the use of live fire guidelines for Israeli soldiers and police. With that, combined with the systemic impunity for lack of accountability when a child is killed by Israeli forces, we had sort of the perfect storm for October 2015, when you had escalations in violence. You had stabbing attacks happening throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and we saw Israeli forces respond with the intentional use of force, right, with relaxed guidelines, with zero accountability, which leads to 2016 being the deadliest year for children in the West Bank. So far in 2017, we've seen this trend continue. We've had 9 children that have been killed by live fire throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And international law mandates that the use of intentional lethal force can only be used when you're challenged with lethal force. And the Israeli standard that has been changed is much below that standard. In many of the cases, we found, and even Israeli investigations have confirmed, that children did not pose a direct threat at the time that they were shot and killed by Israeli forces. Yet, in 80 cases of kids being killed with live ammunition between 2014 and now, there's only been 1 indictment. I want to turn to ill treatment of Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces in charge of the military detention system. So we've been to Capitol Hill, we've worked on this issue, raised this issue, and I think it's the one thing that has galvanized a lot of support throughout the U.S. Because it's a very clear issue, right? You have children, Palestinian children living in the West Bank that are charged in military courts. As Omar mentioned, Israeli military law applies in the West Bank. Since 1967, when Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, they instituted military law. So a military commander has executive, judicial, legislative authority over the entire territory. In theory, and in law, the Israeli military law applies to any person located in the territory. But Israeli authorities choose to apply military law only to the Palestinian population while providing the benefit of Israeli civilian law to Israeli citizens, Israeli settlers living in the same territory. To give you a sense of what military law is, right? It includes a lot of the similar provisions that you would expect in a criminal code, but it also includes more occupation or political offenses. For example, you have homicide, assault, and you also have being a member of a banned organization. Right? So pretty much every political party, military law. The Palestinian president could be arrested under military law, charged in the military court at any time. Specific to children, there's a specific charge, throwing stones. Throwing stones, objects against military installations, right? It comes with a potential 10-year maximum sentence under military law. Throwing stones at moving objects comes with a potential 20-year maximum sentence under international law. So children, the majority of them that are arrested by Israeli forces, charged in the military courts, the charge that they're charged with is throwing stones. A couple other important points. Under military law, soldiers can arrest on suspicion. So it's very rare that there is an actual warrant that's issued for the arrest of a child. Anything that could be used in a prosecution, it comes from that interrogation process. So the majority of children are arrested from their homes in the middle of the night. Right? Heavily armed soldiers coming into the home, banging on the door, gathering everybody in one room. If you're the 15, 16, 17-year-old boy on the list that night, your hands will be tied behind your back, blindfolded, and taken out of the home. You'll be put into a military jeep, likely transferred somewhere nearby, maybe a military camp inside of a settlement, near a settlement. And there you wait. So if you're arrested around 2 a.m., you might sit there until 6, 7, maybe even 8 a.m., waiting for an Israeli police interrogator to show up for his job in the nearby settlement police station. Kids eventually find themselves in that interrogation room. There's shouting, threats, physical violence, really everything you could imagine where you would have psychological or physical force, coercion, with the effort or with the intention of obtaining a confession or some type of incriminating statement that you could then put in a file and hand to a military prosecutor. 96 to 97% of Palestinian children are denied access to attorneys prior to interrogation. So they're bound, blindfolded, taken from their homes. Parents aren't informed where they're being taken. They essentially disappear for a 24, 48, 96-hour period where the interrogation happens. They're denied access to legal counsel. 3 out of 4 experience some form of physical violence during this period. And then they appear in a military court where they first see an attorney and their parents. For detention, we've seen a drastic deterioration in the situation for Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces. Amid heightened violence in fall of 2015, the number of Palestinian children detained in the Israeli prison system spiked dramatically. At the end of March 2016, 444 Palestinian children were in the Israeli military detention system. This is the highest figure since the Israeli Prison Service started releasing data in January 2008. Typically, the average had been around 200 in detention at the end of the month, so this was a significant increase. The numbers now, we don't have a good sense of what they are because the Israeli Prison Service stopped releasing data in May 2016. There's been a few bits that have come out for May and June 2016, but for the past year, we really haven't had much data. 2 other pieces related to detentions. We've seen drastic spikes in the use of solitary confinement for interrogation purposes. So this is not kids being held in solitary or isolation post-sentencing, post-trial. This is pre-trial solitary confinement to facilitate interrogation. So kids are held in isolation, shuffled back and forth between prolonged interrogation sessions where they're often bound to a low metal chair in the middle of the room, questioned for hours on end, and sometimes there's also the use of informants. We've seen the use of administrative detention renewed in 2015. So this is a practice of detaining children and adults without charge or trial. In post-October 2015, it was renewed by the Israeli authorities for use against children, which for a period of about 4 years, there was no case of an administrative order used against a child. I want to just share in closing sort of a recent experience that I think is unique and gets to the heart of the things that we document and the reasons that these violations continue and why the occupation continues. So I guess a week ago on Sunday, I was in the Israeli High Court with a Palestinian father whose son was killed on May 15, 2014 by an Israeli border police officer outside of Ramallah near Ofra Military Court in the West Bank. The boy, he was 17, his name was Nadim. He was shot about around 1 o'clock and killed with live ammunition. We heard about the case, we went out and checked it out at the time when it happened, and we saw CCTV cameras on the building right where Nadim was shot. We ended up being able to capture the video from those cameras, release the footage, showing that Nadim posed absolutely no threat at the time he was shot and killed with live ammunition. The initial story was the Israeli forces did not fire over any live ammunition, only rubber-coated steel bullets were fired, so he couldn't have been killed by Israeli forces because they did not fire live ammunition. And this type of denial is sort of the core of the impunity that continues to be perpetuated when it comes to accountability for cases like this. The family, so Nadim's father, Siam, he, in an effort to prove something that he already knew, that his son was killed with live ammunition, they exhumed their son's body several weeks after he was killed to have an autopsy done. The autopsy confirmed the injuries, and the fatality was caused by live ammunition. There was metallic fragments in his body. And even then, the denial continued from Israeli authorities. Eventually, we built out a forensic video spatial analysis of the killing that pinpointed the specific individual that fired the lethal shot. Following that, there was an indictment. So this is the one case where there's been an indictment since 2014 out of those 80 cases. The indictment didn't come because there's some interest in justice, It came because there was sort of nothing that could be done to deny that this case was actually the facts that were presented. Fast forward, after a 2.5-year legal battle where Nadim's father and family have been working with Israeli prosecutors to prosecute this case, the overwhelming video, forensic evidence in this case that clearly shows Nadim's killer, I find myself with Siam sitting in the High Court, watching as oral arguments take place, where you have the Nawar family essentially arguing against the prosecution, who has a plea deal ready to be accepted with the individual that has killed his son. So to give a sense of the obstacles that Palestinians face in achieving any type of accountability, you have the prosecutor whose purpose is to represent this family in their quest for justice and accountability. And the family is arguing against the prosecution in the Israeli High Court, because they do not support this plea agreement. And sitting there, it becomes very clear that this isn't necessarily about 50 years of occupation. This isn't about green lines. This is really about pervasive and entrenched denial that continues to perpetuate impunity, that denies Palestinians justice and equality, that denies rights, and perpetuates 50 years of occupation. So I'll leave it there. We'll hear from you guys.
Hello everyone, my name is Ziad Al-Maqbil. I lived in the town of Beit Omar in Hebron, the West Bank, before I came to the US in 2015. I will start by saying that the stories that you're going to hear are just, I'm kind of trying to put what Omar and Brad said into my own words and into use my own life and experiences to give you a sense of how it's like to be a child living in the occupied Palestinian territories. So first of all, I'm a refugee. I grew up in a house with 10 demolition orders because it's next to the Israeli settlement of Karmetzur in the West Bank. So we did not have any land, and my dad was kind of forced to build our house in that area. We received the first demolition order in 2002, and my dad started the long battle with the Supreme Court and with the other military courts to cancel that, or to obtain a permit, or at least to stop the demolition order. And of course we did not succeed. He spent almost 10 years until we got the temporary order to stop the military order. Among the years we received 9 more demolition orders, which meant that every single day I used to wake up hoping that, my house is not demolished, and I hope that I can live here for more days. So just living with the fear that the house where I grew up, where I had all my dreams and the crazy chases with my siblings, is just going to be gone someday. Growing up, seeing friends being killed in front of me, seeing people, and I'm sorry, but seeing brains on the floor. Growing up, breathing tear gas in an environment of violence and fear and hearing bullets every day. In 2011, I lost one of my best friends, and obviously it was the beginning of a series where every 3 years I would lose a friend. His name was Yusuf Khlayel. He was working with his family in the Safa area of Beit Omar in their farmland when an Israeli settler shot him. Then in 2014, Muhammad Jawabir from Al-Arub camp was also killed while he was observing what was happening at his refugee camp. He was drinking tea and smoking a cigarette, standing at the window of his second floor of their house, and he was killed by an Israeli sniper. I grew up imagining that all the children in the world just have the kind of similar action Bollywood type of life, thinking that they all have tear gas and bullets, and there are checkpoints. They need to have 3 IDs and I don't know how many passports and permits to move around, and they need to see the separation wall whenever they go to another city. They have to lose friends or be detained, or they have to live with a father who was detained when he was a child. In 2010, the Israeli forces went to my grandfather's house, and they were searching for me, for my name, and for my brother's name. So they went in after midnight, they destroyed all the furniture, and they asked for Yazam Naqbel and for Zainab. And my grandparents had no idea what was happening, considering the fact that I was a nerd. And I'm still trying to stay a nerd, but anyways, so it was finals week back in January of 2010, studying for my finals, and I woke up around 3 a.m. to just review my exam, and I had a science exam that day, and I heard what sounded like sound bombs and tear gas grenades and just shooting that was in my grandfather's area, 10 minutes away from where we live. And then I just woke up in the morning again and went to school, and my uncle stopped me in the way and he said, what did you do? And he was laughing and he said, you're really dangerous, they're looking for you. And I thought he was just, I don't know, a way of encouraging me to go to the exam and be fine, but I went home and I saw my dad, he closed the door when he saw me, and he was on the phone, stressed out. And then 10 minutes later, he came to me and he said, there's something bad that really happened. And I asked him what happened. He said, the Israeli army wants to arrest you. At that minute, I know that I'm not throwing any stones, I'm not participating in any protests, and I'm not giving the Israeli army any reason, even as a child, to be arrested. So I spent a week sleeping. It was January, and usually when you're detained after midnight, in a lot of the cases, the Israeli forces won't allow you to put clothes on. They just take you, you go to the interrogation center, and that's it. So I slept with my shoes on, with a jacket, and just prepared that any minute, whether they knock on the door or they just raid in the house, I'll be arrested. I lived with that fear alongside with my brother Zan for a week, and then just thinking of the idea that I might be arrested was terrifying. At that time, it was the first time when my father told us about his story of being a 15-year-old detained during the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987. My dad was 15 years old, again, a nerd hoping to be a chemist. He used to love soccer, and he just went to school, went back home, and he tried not to get involved in anything, even hanging out a lot with his friends, considering what was happening at that time. So he said he was arrested at the beginning when the Israeli border police came into the house, and they took him to his high school that was turned into an interrogation center in Beit Omar, and he spent 20 days under interrogation, where he would stand up, and I want to perform this in front of you, where he would stand up every day for 8 hours at least, putting his hands up and lifting one of his legs. Every day for 8 hours. And that continued for 20 days. Then he was released, and just remember that he was 15 years old. He was released after 20 days for the lack of evidence. At that time, he did not participate in any protests, and he did not want to do anything, because at the end of the day, being in jail is the last thing a child wants to happen. But then he realized that whatever I do, whatever I'm studying, being at home, throwing stones, it doesn't matter. They're coming after me. So he started participating in protests, protesting the injustice and inequality of the occupation. Then when he was 16 years old, he was shot in the head, a live bullet that almost took away his life. He spent 6 weeks in the Maqasid hospital in Jerusalem, unconscious, and they almost announced his death twice. Hearing my dad saying these stories was a shock, because I didn't know that all of that happened. And then thinking that that could have been me was not an easy thing at all. And then he continued by telling us the second arrest story. When he was around 17 years old, he was arrested again from his house, and he was transferred to a Naqab prison, and he spent 1.5 years in a Naqab prison living, and it's in the desert living in tents, and he went on a hunger strike that was for 2 weeks, and again he was 17 years old. Growing up with these stories and being a refugee and losing friends and having cousins and friends being detained and arrested every day, being detained and interrogated at different checkpoints, being afraid of being detained, just that idea of going to prison for nothing, I don't do anything. It's just insane. And when I moved to the United States in 2015 for school, I used to carry my passport wherever I go. And every single time I saw a police car or a police officer, I freaked out. I tried to behave, even I changed the way I walk. I don't look at them in the eye. I try to avoid them. I change the street if it's necessary, thinking that it's the same. These are police officers, they have guns. And a lot of my American friends noticed that kind of strange behavior. Why do you even carry your passport? Especially that it's a Palestinian passport, and if I lose it, it's not easy to get a new one. So I told them, that's my background, and this is what the police officers usually do. And they told me no. They're here to protect you, not to shoot you, or not to arrest you. Of course, after 2 years, that's not always the case in the United States. But as a guest in this country, I would say that I tried my best not to carry my passport around, and just to smile whenever I see an officer. And until now, whenever I see the lights, I just freak out. And I thought that my life is great, and I don't have all of these psychological effects or disorders or whatever, what my professors usually talk about. But then, being here every day, I learn more that the life that I had, and the life that my siblings and my friends had, I don't even know if I should call it life, to be honest, because we have a saying in Palestine that we are living because of the lack of death. We don't have any hopes. There's no future. We have to go through checkpoints, and we have the separation wall and settlements, and just soldiers, and we have a military occupation. And it's really hard to imagine. A lot of people can't even comprehend the idea of having a soldier coming into your house after midnight with a mask on, with having a lot, I don't know how many weapons, and it's just scary. When you wake up, and working with No Way to Treat a Child, I did the interviews with the kids who were showing the documentary, and Abdurrahman Jawabri said, just waking up and seeing that image of the soldier telling me Habibi, which means sweetheart in Arabic, just get up, let's go, was not pleasant at all. And excuse my English, I don't know, I can't think of any word to describe it, because it's really indescribable. However, despite all the occupation barriers, and despite all of the pain, killings, and the daily arrests, and despite our daily life as Palestinians. I was in Palestine over my winter break, and I had a lot of discussions with my friends who proved to me that they're really growing up, and they're really reading about Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and they're reading the stories of the civil rights movement in the US, about South Africa, and they're trying to find a solution. They're sick of having these long, I think, useless negotiations. They're sick of having politicians who are not representing them, living under military occupation, and considering the regional instability in the Middle East and what's happening in Syria and everywhere. It's really hard to imagine a solution. Two-state solution, a one-state solution, a no-state solution, there's no solution at all. So just having that idea of we all have a dream. Martin Luther King had a dream, and I'm hoping that he could achieve at least part of it. As Palestinians, we all have a dream to be free, to live like normal human beings, not to be afraid whenever we leave our homes, not to be scared that I'll be killed or I'll be detained, and just to have water games at least. Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, he was the first president of Czechoslovakia after the Soviet Union. He had this idea of living the lie. We think that what we have is good. We think that our daily lives are fine, and we think that everybody else is living the same as we are. Coming to the United States and seeing the other face of what being a child could be woke me up to live the truth and to notice and to realize that I really was, it's not just the occupation of land, not the having 10 demolition orders, but it's also the killing and murder of my own childhood, the killing and murder of 2 of my friends, and the detention of my father that destroyed his future and forced him to leave school. I'm sure that after this, a lot of us will go back to our daily lives. Maybe if you have children, we'll just play with them, walk with them. I just want you to remember that it could be your child, it could be your brother, it could be your sister. And living in the US does not mean because you are away from it, it doesn't really affect you, because it does in a lot of ways. So this is a shout out to all of you, and this is a request from a Palestinian whose his childhood was taken away from him. Please do something. Please do something. Thank you.
Thank you, Yazan. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you all for being here. My name is Nadia Ben Youssef. I'm the director of the Adala Justice Project, and have been working for the last 7 years with Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. And this is why we're here. I hope you all, this is why you're here, to listen to Yazan's story, to think a bit beyond crude figures and statistics that often rule our decision making. In fact, we are here because of Yazan, we are here because of Youssef and Muhammad. This is a human issue. It's a human issue. Politics is a human issue. We are lawyers, we'll talk a bit about the legal regime and the legal system, but we are talking about human beings. And this is an urgent issue because of that. 50 years. 50 years. What was happening 50 years ago? Yazan's father wasn't even born 50 years ago. This is a human issue. I'm going to talk and contextualize the occupation and bring us back a little bit into the historic depth, the legal regime that governs people's lives. But as I speak, remember that we are talking about people's lives. 50 years of occupation. 50 years of occupation, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't just emerge out of nothing. It is grounded in history. It's grounded in history, it's grounded in a historical and a legal context that predates the occupation, that predates 1967, as often these issues do. There's a historic depth that we have to be committed to uncovering and to understanding, because if we don't understand the problem, how can we possibly understand the solution? So the occupation is often understood as this blight, this anomaly in the history of Israel, emerged potentially, if we are at our best, acknowledging that it's problematic, that there are violations that are happening, but it's distinct from Israel, it's distinct from the legal and political regime of the Israeli government. It's over there, something bad is happening, and it's completely different and disconnected to Israel, which is known as the only democracy in the Middle East. It's understood as founded on principles of equality and justice, and that is simply not true. So I want to bring us back to 1948. And I actually also want to shout out a curriculum that might be useful that's being launched this summer by the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And it looks actually at the breadth of this history under the idea of 100, 70, 50, 10, 100 years since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, 70 years since the partition plan of 1947, 50 years of occupation, and 10 years since the siege on Gaza. This is a history. This is a history. But I'm going to talk about 1948 because it's critical, and it grounds a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, particularly with regard to Palestinian citizens of Israel and how that connects to the occupation. The occupation is an outgrowth. The occupation is a symptom. We're going to begin the story in 1948, and it's called the Nakba. And I want you all to remember that name, write that name, say that name, Nakba, N-A-K-B-A. The Nakba, it means catastrophe in Arabic. And it refers to the founding of the State of Israel, the dispossession of Palestinian land, the displacement of around 750,000 people, the demolition of 500 villages, the catastrophe. What happened in the Nakba really grounds our understanding of what's going on both inside Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory. Because the Nakba set up a legal and political regime that critically privileged the rights of certain people on the basis of who they are, subjugated, conditioned, or suspended the rights of others on the basis of who they are. The legal regime of Israel that was established in 1948 was premised on this idea that the Jewish people were deserving of more rights than any non-Jewish person that was living in that land. Israel was established as a Jewish state to privilege the rights of Jewish people. The Nakba occurred, 750,000 people became refugees, including Yazan's family. 750,000 people became refugees, 150,000 people stayed, remained on their land, remained inside this new Israel, this new Jewish state of Israel. Palestinians who remained on their land and ultimately became citizens in 1952, so just a few years later became citizens, 150,000 people, who now make up 1.3 million people, or 20% of the population of Israel. 1 in 5 Israelis is a Palestinian. I'm going to say that again. 1 in 5 Israelis is a Palestinian. 20% of the population is not Jewish. 20% of the population of this Jewish state that is premised on the basis that you must have greater rights. You are privileged with more resources. You are privileged with more rights on the basis of your identity. 1 in 5 of those citizens is not Jewish. How do you protect the rights of non-Jews in a Jewish state? What does this mean? Omar, he opened with this idea of a Jewish and democratic state. Can you be both a Jewish state that privileges the rights of certain people on the basis of who they are and claim to be a democracy that guarantees equality for all? Does that make sense? We say it like so. We say it so easily. Obama says it. Our presidents say it. We say it in the corridors of power, a Jewish and democratic state. As if that makes sense. As if that makes sense. The ideas about what that means and what the impact is most visible in three areas. So I'm going to talk about three main areas and then close with a story, a human story, that ties, I think, a lot of these things together. In fact, though, I want to say one more thing about this history before I go into kind of how the legal regime was grounded. So we have, again, 150,000 people, right, who remained, became citizens. But what's critical here, and now it ties us into the story of the occupation, is that from 1948 until 1966, 18 years, the first years of the establishment of the State of Israel, these Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under a military regime. Lived under a military regime. We've heard what that means. We understand what a military regime is. Permit restrictions, administrative detention, restrictions on freedom of movement, tanks, surveillance in your cities and on your streets and in your villages. It's an important date, right? Until 1966, they lived under a military regime. What happened in 1967? What are we commemorating now? The transfer of that military regime to the occupied Palestinian territory. And the systems of land confiscation and displacement that I'm going to talk about quickly were in practice first, and were practiced first on Palestinian citizens of Israel. So land confiscation. So the founding of the state really is about confiscating Palestinian land and concentrating that land into the power and into the hands of the state. So you had a number of land laws that justified that confiscation and ended up so that Israel now owns and controls 93% of the land of the state. So all of that Palestinian land was confiscated, it's in control of the state, and formalized in law. Formalized in law. So you have massive concentration and confiscation of land, dispossession of Palestinian ownership of that land. And as the state is established, there's a founding law that I think is quite critical, which defines how you maintain this Jewish nature of the state, which is called the law of return. Are you familiar with the law of return? The law of return, which allows any Jewish person anywhere in the world to automatically become a citizen of the state. If you're a Jewish person anywhere in the world, you can automatically become a citizen of the state. The law of return, the ingathering of the exiles, as declared in the Declaration of Independence. So the law of return should be understood as coupled, as yoked with, and this is how these laws work, the denial of the Palestinian refugees' right of return. Right? So all of any Jewish person in the world can automatically become a citizen, and any Palestinian who became a refugee cannot return to their land. Because the idea of the Jewish state is to maintain a demographic majority at ownership of the land and to maintain a demographic majority in the space of the land. So that means more Jewish people than anyone else in that land in order to maintain this idea of a democracy. We're tying demography, numbers of people, to the idea of democracy, which is quite important. So you have the confiscation of land, you have, good, 2 minutes, easy. The confiscation of land, the demolition of homes. So what was happening in the Nakba continues to today. So as we're looking at figures from 2012 to 2014, 97% of home demolitions occurred in Arab localities. So if you remember the Nakba, 500 villages were destroyed, right? 500 villages, over 500. About 139 villages remained. So the remaining Palestinians were concentrated in those 139 villages. There has not been one new Palestinian village created inside Israel. Not one new one, but the population has boomed. So it's 150,000 people who are now 1.3 million people still living in 139 Palestinian villages. So you have huge overcrowding and concentration of people, and what has happened is because there's limits on permits and limits to the natural growth of these villages for various reasons, as Yazan said, people are building unauthorized buildings. Very difficult to get permits. There's no natural growth. There are no new places to live. So people who are having children and growing, and there's natural growth, have nowhere to go. They're building unauthorized buildings. In April of this year, a law was passed called the Kamenetz Law that's trying to streamline the demolition of these unauthorized buildings, taking them outside of the court structure and saying you can just demolish them. If you see it, it's an unauthorized building, demolish it, there's no recourse in law. This is legalized and passed in 2017. So the confiscation of land, the home demolitions, that I hope resonates, because we've heard a bit about that in the occupied Palestinian territories happening inside Israel. So the confiscation continues, the demolitions are legalized, and the land regime continues to benefit Jewish citizens and deny the rights of Palestinian citizens. So the land regime is formulated in this way. Citizenship is similarly formulated, and I think that's critical. I told you that these Palestinians became citizens, were granted citizenship in 1952, but it's an interesting citizenship. It's a citizenship that's bifurcated into citizenship and nationality. Citizenship is Israeli, nationality is either Jewish or Arab. Your citizenship is Israeli, but your nationality is Jewish or Arab. Why? Because we have to find a way to distinguish so that we can allocate resources and allocate rights accordingly. So citizenship in the law has entrenched a hierarchy of life and a hierarchy of values. So the Citizenship Law of 1952. Last Sunday, Adala was in court. Adala was in court defending a young man whose citizenship is about to be revoked. So something important is happening apparently in Washington on the idea of loyalty oaths. And in 2008, there was an amendment to the Citizenship Law that says you can revoke citizenship. Why? For a breach of loyalty. For a breach of loyalty. So these citizens who might seem to be unloyal or perceived to be disloyal to the state can have their citizenship revoked, and that's being used primarily and only against Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's prohibited by international law. Citizenship is conditional. Citizenship is conditional, and it leads us to what I think we've been talking about a bit now too in terms of accountability and impunity, and what is the impact when your life is not valued. We know that as American citizens what that means. The impact on your life when your life is not valued by the state means that your life can be taken away, that there is no accountability if that happens, and that indeed is the case for Palestinian citizens of Israel. From 2012 till 2016, around 90% of cases of police violence were closed, the vast majority without investigations. For extrajudicial killings and extrajudicial executions that Brad and Yazan talked about, indictments are so small to be zero. The indictment against Nadim's killer is such an anomaly in these situations. So indictments are zero. Since 2000, 48 Palestinian citizens of Israel have been killed by police, and there is no accountability for their deaths. When your life is not valued, your life can be taken away. When the law doesn't protect your rights and doesn't deem you to be equal, the situation is, for Palestinian citizens of Israel, for Palestinians living under occupation, is the same. When your life is not valued, you can hold millions of people under a military regime. When your lives and your rights are not valued, you can be demoted in your citizenship. Your citizenship can be revoked. You can live for 10 years under a siege and blockade in an open-air prison. If your life is not valued, if the law doesn't protect your rights, then this is the situation. The occupation is a symptom of this problem. There's no right to equality in Israel, and I think you need to write that down and send that message to your decision makers. There's no right to equality in Israel. It's not enshrined in law. There's no such thing as the right to equality enshrined in law, because they cannot protect equality and protect privilege. You cannot both protect equality and protect privilege. The story that I want to close with is a story of Hiran, and I think it brings all of these things together. Hiran is an unrecognized village in the Naqab, in the south of Israel, Hiran. It was established by military order in 1956. So the people were moved from their homes near Gaza to this place in Hiran, where they lived for 60 years. But it was an unrecognized village. This is a phenomenon that's pretty unique to Israel. Unrecognized village means that it doesn't exist on any state map, even though the state established this village. It doesn't exist on any state map. There's no infrastructure, no water, no electricity, no roads. These are citizens of Israel. They've lived there for 60 years. Hiran. In 2003, demolition orders were issued on all of the homes in Hiran. We're talking about Hiran and Nativ, these twin villages. We're talking 1,000 people. Home demolition orders on all of their homes. The reason that the homes are being demolished is to establish a Jewish town called Hiran. Remember that name. Hiran, the Bedouin village, Hiran, the Jewish town. These homes are being demolished in order to establish a Jewish town on top of their ruins. Adala represented this case before the courts and went all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court. It was 13 years of litigation, challenging this notion that you could displace people on the basis of who they are and put on top of them other people with more rights, the better citizens. And we challenged that in the Israeli Supreme Court, and we lost. And we lost the case. The court said, yes, fine, we gave you that land, but we can take it away. You are not the right kind of citizens. The court didn't say that. I'm saying that. But we can take it away. These are not the right kind of citizens. This is happening in Hiran. So in 2017, the demolitions began. The demolitions began against these communities. 15 structures were demolished. 15 structures demolished, 8 homes were demolished in Hiran. I just saw it for the first time 2 weeks ago with Brad, and I was shocked to have seen it. I wasn't expecting it. What happened in 2017 is that before the home was being demolished, what happens is people are rushing to take their valuables out of their home. So this man, Yakub Abulkian, 50 years old, a math teacher, the father of 13 children, took all of those possessions out of his home, his computers, his anything valuable that he could, and he put them in his truck, and he started to move away from the site, and the police killed him. The police shot at the moving vehicle. He was killed. His car veered into police, and the car killed a police officer. And immediately, the police said this was a terrorist attack. The man was ramming into the police officers. He was part of ISIS, and the public security minister, Gilad Erdan, immediately said, this is, we are responding. He was killed. It was a successful stopping of a terrorist attack. And immediately the footage came out as well, which showed that the police fired first, and he was killed before he struck the officer. But that culture of lying and the culture of impunity persists. And Yakub was murdered. His children are fatherless and now living in a tent next to their demolished home. This is inside Israel. These are citizens of Israel. And this is a story of privilege, too. It's a story of inequality. It's a story that says that certain lives are more valuable on the basis of who they are. And these people, the citizens of Israel who are going to move into Hiran, it's critical to note, are connected to the settlements in Hebron and the settlement of Susia in the West Bank. And they're living now in a forest inside Israel, waiting for the entire village to be destroyed before they can move in. This idea that there is a bad occupation and a good Israel, that there's a division of ideas and ideologies that distinguish the occupation from the inherent nature of a state that is founded on the basis that certain people deserve more rights on the basis of who they are, is a false notion. And so we have to, in our thinking of what the problem is and what our thinking of the solution is, center rights. Center, how do we protect the rights of all the people living on this land? And then emerge from there. The solution emerges from there. And so as my colleagues have said, the conversation is about rights. In order to end the occupation, you have to center the rights of Palestinians, you have to center the rights of people who are on that land, and demand equality, demand justice, demand freedom for all, and it's your responsibility. It's your responsibility. You must do it, we must do it. 50 years is not only enough, it is 50 years too many. And it isn't 50 years. It's a history of dispossession and a history of injustice, and I welcome all of your efforts to stop it. Thank you.
I think this was probably better than any briefing that's being held elsewhere today, right? Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all your patience. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We've had a lot of compelling testimonies from all four of you. So we have some time here for questions. If you just want to try to keep it brief so we can get to as many questions as possible, maybe state who you are, I'll call on you, and who you want to address your question to. Yes, sir.
Thinking of the American aid to Israel.
Can you say who you are and who?
I'm Dr. Siddiq from England University,
Okay, thank you.
and I'm a human rights activist. The American aid to Israel. Isn't that the key to the whole situation?
Okay.
The United States will make some effort to even-handed. That could be the solution, otherwise these law cases will go on forever. But the military aid is coming from here, and President Obama, ex-President Obama, gave a special last-minute gift, $38 billion, biggest military package to Israel ever given, just before it.
So there's a question about military aid.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just try to speak loudly. U.S. military aid and taxpayer funding allows the occupation to continue, right? It allows settlement expansion. I mean, we are subsidizing and complicit in perpetuating this occupation. Is it the, I think the core of your question, is it the silver bullet, whether, that could be stopped or not? I mean, I think the broader response is that it's a complete lack of political will from the international community, including the U.S. government, the American people, right? It's a failure of political will on all levels to demand something beyond the one-state, two-state political discourse. And I think this is the theme that we want to sort of convey, and I think comes through, is that the solution needs to be grounded in a rights-based framework. You can't have a solution where one group of people have superior rights, and to protect their security, they are oppressing the rights of another people. So I think the complete lack of political will, the failures of policy and decision makers to have a vision that challenges systemic impunity that's inherent in the occupation, is really why we continue to tack on years to this occupation that has no end in sight.
Sorry. My name is Jesse. I'm a reporter for a publication called Otherwise, and I just, no one specific, but when I hear, when we talk about Palestinian children being detained like this, I think immediately of the fact that this happens in the U.S. Like this boy, Browner, who was put in administrative detention essentially. It's a very sad story. Anyway, my question is, so how much reform do you think is possible within the system, within the current system, or how much do we need to retreat from Zionism and from the state?
So on the child detention piece, I mean, I think the reason why ill treatment and detention of Palestinian children by Israeli forces is an issue that's been elevated not just in the U.S. but also throughout the international community is because it's something that anybody can sort of associate with. Everybody can picture what it would mean to have their son, nephew, sibling detained in the middle of the night, and for many communities, particularly in the U.S., I mean, that sort of targeting of youth by police or in the case of the occupation, military forces for arrest, I mean, it's not a unique situation to Palestinian children. So it is a very shared experience, and that's one of the things that in my work here in the U.S. it really comes through, and I think Yaz has spoke to it a bit as well. I think, so we work and we represent kids in the Israeli military force. So on the one hand, we're pushing for increased protections to end ill treatment and torture that kids face when they are arrested, but ultimately we're challenging the system as a whole. Right? The military court system is not a justice system. It's not intended to hold individuals accountable for specific conduct. It's really the legal mechanism and legal tool used to implement the occupation, which military occupation, right, this is not unique to Israel, this is not unique to this occupation. Military occupation is about controlling the population, right? So if you arrest 700, 500, 700,000 Palestinian boys from the West Bank, from their homes in the middle of the night, from communities that are located near settlements, near the separation wall, right? Those places where occupation has its infrastructure. You run them through a military court process where pretrial detention is the norm. They serve anywhere from a month to 6 months to a year in pretrial detention. When they come out, right, they're less likely to be involved in any type of, not just resistance activity, violent activity, political activity. They withdraw from society. Right? That's a very real thing. And when you see that, and when you see the breakdown of family that happens when a child is taken away from their home in the middle of the night, parents can't do anything to stop it. That plays into the fragmentation of the Palestinian society and breakdown of communities. And that is where I think the control aspect of the legal tool at the military courts is most stark. And that's really at the essence of why you don't see Israeli officials trying to make the military detention system better for kids. Right? It's not the point. They're not interested in that. It's really about the control aspects and using this process for maintaining control of populations.
And I think, for human rights and human rights lawyers and movement lawyers, what you're doing is you're using the system, yes, and you're working within the system, but you're trying to expose and advocate for a transformation of the system, and to use, it's so difficult to tell the story of Women Haran and to tell you that we lost the case, but we also bought 13 years of time for the community to start mobilizing and organizing behind us, so we're using the law in a way where you take a case that if you win, but if you lose, you also win, because you're trying to expose the injustice of the system. So I think if we keep, we have to just make sure that that's our focus too, and that we're very transparent about that too. That otherwise you risk legitimizing the system as you're engaging with it, because then the state of Israel or the United States says, look, our justice system works, and people come and approach us, and we just found ourselves to be innocent. The police, we investigated ourselves, but nothing. In fact, it was a professional mistake, or it was not a mistake at all. So unless we are very, as advocates and as human rights defenders, really explicit about our understanding of the nature of the system, then you risk legitimizing it. But it's something that we think a lot about, particularly if there's a closing space in courts, to even delay home demolitions. So part of that bill the Kamenetz law, was about kind of going around a situation like Women Haran, where because a 13-year delay in the intentions of the state, so they want to take it out of the courts and say, just administratively demolish that home because we need to move our ideology and our process forward. So I think we have to, there's a balance, but so long as you recognize that the issue is the system and the tools, you're using whatever tools you have to serve as a shield to the people and to protect their rights.
Hi, my name is Emily Nelson. I'm from Congressman Hudson's office, 8th District, North Carolina. This is a question for Yasmin. You were talking about how difficult it was to obtain permits and access to the unit was very limited. I was wondering if you could tell us how you came to study in the United States. And then also, as a question about your childhood, did you go to school with Israeli children, or were the schools separated as well?
I did not go. So for the schooling system in the West Bank, it's only either Palestinian or Israeli. Now the only mix that you could find is in few schools in Jerusalem or inside Israel. So for the West Bank, Palestinian children go to only Palestinian schools. And the schools are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Now for coming to the United States, it was, I was seeking a place where I would be away from what's happening, just focus on college. And of course that did not happen after I came here, because I found myself involved in fighting for the same things that I'm fighting for back home. I like to describe it as, in Palestine, it's military occupation, and in the U.S. in some places, it's an occupation under a different name, under a different label. It's an occupation of communities. So coming to the United States, I applied for civil schools. And then in 2015, I had the support of Leonard Education Organization, where my college gave me scholarship, and then Leonard gave me another scholarship as well. I wanted to study international studies and peace and justice studies, but there was a lot of studying, I guess. So I decided to go with biochemistry. So yeah. That didn't help either. But anyways, so yeah, I'm kind of going the crazy activist / scientist now.
Sir?
Hi, Ryan Suno, Human Relations Manager at Arab American Institute. So, quick question. Have there been any avenues of change, whether legal or otherwise, that have shown promise that you think outside actors could invest, whether any kind of time or energy in? And I can open to anybody on the panel. Thank you.
Sure, I mean, I would say on the accountability front, the International Criminal Court has now opened a preliminary examination into the issue of abuses committed on the state of Palestine, as the state of Palestine has signed the Rome Statute, making them a member of the International Criminal Court. So that examination is slowly moving forward. Human Rights Watch has called on the International Criminal Court to open to move the examination to a formal investigation. So I think there's some hope that even if the court itself doesn't ultimately move forward, that sort of that process of accountability can sort of catalyze other efforts. I think there have been significant steps taken around businesses and settlements. Human Rights Watch has called for a cessation of all business activities and settlements because it violates the UN guiding principles that sort of set out guidelines for how businesses should operate in settlements. And I think you've seen a number of states in Europe and elsewhere take policies to distinguish between goods that come from Israel and from the settlements, and that is, a step in sort of the right direction. And I think you've seen, some efforts and understanding in different countries and sort of other efforts that have centered, I think, more calls for action and accountability. Again, it's not yet translated to the situation on the ground. I mean, you still have the Gaza closure, and you still have these sort of systematic abuses we document taking place. But I do think there's been some movement. It's not always easy to sort of see that progress in this part of this country, because I think on the congressional side, on the U.S. policy side, we still aren't seeing those sort of changes taking place, but I think there are some prospects that offer some hope.
Is there any other congressional office staff here who have a question? Because we have limited time, we want to go to them first. Okay, if not,
I'm Christy Sanders. Nobody's important. My question is mainly about your campaign goals and your strategies to reach the goals. What I hear you guys saying, like when Dr. City asked a question about the U.S. funding, you kind of shook it and said, your approach is more about human rights and trying to equality and kind of that approach to try to get people to understand and compassion. And I like that. I mean, I think that is absolutely what is going to be required in order to get any effective change. But this is not new news to the decision makers. It's not anything new. They already know it. And are you trying to bring about some sort of epiphany with them? Or are you trying to get them to finally understand what it's really like? Because what I heard him saying is that, remember, it could be your son or your daughter. And you were saying that we all know what it's like. What you said, we all know what that means, that when our life is not important, what that can mean. And you said, you know, it's easy to think that it could be your nephew, or it's not easy. We cannot, I cannot imagine what it's like. I can't. Nobody can. And we don't know what that means. We do not know what it means not to have our life valued when we're here. We don't know, and it's not easy. And so it kind of makes me think that you guys are thinking that with these words that and the statistics that you guys are giving, that it's going to bring about some sort of epiphany, and it's not going to happen. They are not going to get, they already know the information. And so I want to know, what is your point? Really, what are you trying to do? And what methods are you going to bring about to get that compassion? Because what I see is, like I was just telling him, my grandson is, you know, I gave him just a little rundown of what we were going to do before we went to go take pictures of the White House. And I said, you know, and I gave him an analogy, you know, and it was devastating. He understood it, because I said, you know, what if they took our little town in Texas and did this and did that, and he was hurt. And it's almost like it's going to take a childish motivation that you're going to get these politicians to become like children to pretend. Let us pretend.
I'll answer.
Sorry.
We're over time, so we actually do not have the room right now. So if you bear with me, we'll take a couple of so thank you for your comment. I think, so for the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, the goal is to change policy. Right? But we recognize that we can't do that overnight, that we need to build a movement that forces change, that demands change, that unites Americans, engaging with their members of Congress and their policymakers, demanding specific rights-based changes and demands that challenge the occupation, that challenge the impunity that perpetuates it. So through the campaign, we've been building that. Right? We know that it's not a short-term thing, but at least for Defense for Children International Palestine, as a local Palestinian organization, we felt the space that had been created in the U.S. Among the general public opened the door to engage with members of Congress in a way that could be constructive, that could start building the base for a rights-based discourse around Israel-Palestine. We wanted to focus on a narrow rights-based issue, tailored to children, as a kind of a narrow focus that allows issues to be raised that then open the door to the broader rights violations that Palestinians face living under occupation. So in some ways, we've got a lot of work to do, right? And it's on all of us to think about it from a rights-based framework, to engage with our members of Congress, and we know that they know the situation. Right? Our annual human rights report from the State Department each year, for the past 10 years, right, over a decade, has included information on ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children as a systematic, institutionalized, widespread violation. Right? It's not a secret, right? But there isn't a political force and mobilization and the movement behind the things that we're asking for and that we know should be the case. Right? We're not going to get members of Congress to do that. So, since we started the campaign in 2015, right, we have 19 members of Congress that signed on to a letter, dear colleague letter to Secretary Kerry back in 2015. 19 members of Congress saying that ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children is wrong, and they want something to happen about it and have it be prioritized in the U.S. relationship with the Israeli authorities. Right? 19 members of Congress standing up on a Palestinian rights issue related to children. In 2016, we had another letter with 20 members of Congress that signed on, demanding that the Secretary, or that President Obama create a special envoy for Palestinian children to look into the situation of the willful killings, ill treatment and torture, right? To get a sense of what is happening and to figure out the data and information to build it forward. We hopefully will have new things coming this year as part of the campaign that will drive people and constituents to action, to be able to engage with members of Congress on these issues in a very concrete way that allows us to build that movement and force that change. And we can talk more. But I would make a plug. The No Way to Treat a Child.org, the website there has also more information.
Maybe we should put in yours.
Yeah, I think we should.
So thank you all for coming today, and thank you to people online. This conversation was recorded, so if you'd like to share the recording with other people in your networks, you can go to our No Way to Treat a Child website. Thank you. Thank you.
I was busy.